Hello, everyone. Kelly here today to talk to you a little bit about narrative and narrative essay. So, I'm going to start with the $5,000 word in the room, narrative. Narrative is just a big fancy college word that means story. So, if I have asked you to write a narrative essay for me, I would just like you to tell me a story, and that can be a story from your personal life. It could be a story that you've completely made up. It could be, heck, I'll even take a little bit of fan fiction if you are so inclined. I get narrative stories that are uh, for Dungeons and Dragons. I get narrative stories that are, people's best days and worst days, and a movie they'd like to develop for later on down the line. I am totally open to however you want to write your narrative essay. And I want to talk today about best practices for narratives, for storytelling, and talk a little bit also about kind of how to set it up and some of the good ways that we can go about it. So I'm going to have us start with narrative arc. Now, most good stories are going to follow this narrative arc formation. We're going to start at the start with an inciting incident, and I'm going to break that down in a moment. Then we're going to go into the rising action, like we're going up the roller coaster. Then we're going to hit the climax. And I always think the very top of the roller coaster is the most exciting part. My fellow roller coaster enthusiasts know what I'm talking about. It's that moment where the roller coaster goes click, 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 and you hear that last click, and then your stomach comes up in your chest, and then the car starts to fall, and then the ride really begins, and then usually ends way too quickly into the resolution. So if we are telling a good story, if we're telling a good narrative, we're generally going to follow this pattern. So let's start at the start and end at the end. So some people think maybe they should start their narrative over here, right at the very beginning, right? If you're going to tell a story, you want to start at the start. But that's not actually always the best way. You're getting in the car, or maybe you've been in line for 2 or 3 hours at Cedar Point, who knows? But the very beginning, you've got kind of rolling hills, there's not a lot going on. And in today's fast-paced, short attention span world, if that story doesn't get off to a good start, people are just going to walk away, right? They're going to start scrolling on their phones. They're going to go in a different direction. They're going to walk out of the movie theater, switch to a different streaming program, leave that book and start something else. So we'll often say starting way back here isn't necessarily the best way. What we usually want to do is actually start somewhere right around here when the rising action has already begun. So I'll have you guys think first about the big action movies of the day, right? We're all about the Marvel Cinematic Universe or the DC Universe or everything in between. Pretty much every action movie, Fast and Furious, starts out with a big explosion. There's a big fight scene, there's a big heist, there's some kind of major action that sends things into motion. Now, there's always that part in between, but it's often best to start here and then work your way back and fill in some of those gaps once you've really hooked your reader or your viewer, once you've gotten their attention. So the best way to start a narrative, folks, is to start with an inciting incident, something big that's already begun or started happening. And then you can go in and fill in some of those back gaps once you've grabbed people's attention. The next thing we want to do is we want to start going up the roller coaster with rising action. And we're going to do that a few different ways, but one of the most important ways we're going to do that is with conflict. And that could be conflict of character, it could be conflict in the plot line, it could be we'll often talk about some of your major plots are going to be, you'll often have person versus person, or person versus nature, or you might also have person versus self, even where the conflict is internal. But we need to have some kind of good conflict in that rising action if we are going to keep up that momentum that we have gotten by grabbing the audience. So I think for most of us, a lot of that's going to boil down to character, because we need characters that we care about, right? Think about a time when you were introduced or you started watching something and you just didn't care about the character. Well, did you stay with it, or did you choose something else next time? Did you watch an episode or two and you're like, no, I don't really care about those people. Not necessarily for me. If that's the case, it's probably because you don't see yourself in the character, or the character is not motivating or interesting, or you just don't really care exactly where they're going. So hopefully we can get some good conflict going, and hopefully from there, then we get to our big climax. That's the big shootout, the big heist scene, the big explosion. That's when the guy gets the gal, or the guy gets the guy. It's the most exciting part. Now, as you're thinking about writing your own stories, because we want to connect this to the narratives that you might write. Let's say that you chose to write about an important day in your life. Maybe it was your worst day, maybe it was your best day. This climax needs to be kind of the most exciting part. And really, it's the reason why you're telling this story. It's because in that climax, something was so big, so momentous, so important, that you wanted to write this story about it. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a crazy shootout, or a wild, thinking about like Too Fast, Too Furious, right? A big car chase, but it should be something that after our readers or viewers or whatnot have grabbed onto our inciting incident, they've grabbed onto our character and their conflict. This is going to be the big moment for them, where the character has face their dragons or face their demons, and then they're going to come back out on the other side having changed. So after the conflict, the climax, then we're going to start to get the falling action. And this is moving our way towards the resolution. And if you think about being on a roller coaster, this happens really fast, right? It's straight down, and then through the tunnel, and then you're off the car, and you just waited in line 3 hours for this part, and then this part ends up just going way, way too fast. And I love a good roller coaster, but I think you guys know what I mean. So if we're thinking about balance, right? If we're thinking about organizing an essay, we really want to make sure that we're starting in the action, that we're building conflict in, that something exciting and big happens, and it's not just 1 or 2 sentences as an afterthought. Maybe make it a whole paragraph or a whole page. Like, the exciting part needs to be the exciting part. And then you're going to move towards a resolution. And maybe it is lessons learned, maybe it's a cliffhanger into the next story, maybe it can be many different things. You see, there's also this fancy French term for the conclusion or the resolution: denouement. I only bring this up because it comes up in trivia and like on Jeopardy and stuff. Sometimes it's nice to be aware of that. But the resolution is going to be different based on the medium and things like that. Think about, a movie that hopefully maybe isn't going to have sequels and third, fourth, fifth, sixth. I don't know. I think they're on Fast and Furious 9. I don't know. But if you kind of think about a self-contained story, we should be taking everything that kind of happened here, and it should all be wrapped up and connected here. This is what I love about Charles Dickens. And I know not everybody loves Dickens. I know he's actually not really a favorite, but he will add and add and add all of these details, and they will all come back together in the end. That's really satisfying for me. I do not like it when a writer introduces different things and then we never hear about them again. That's very frustrating to me. And speaking of frustrating, that's just one for me. I only point this out because I want you to be thinking about the endings that are satisfying to you, and I want your ending to be so satisfying. Now, a lot of students like to ask me now, well, what do you think about a cliffhanger? And I would say, I like a cliffhanger as long as this is wrapped up in a bow. So I like it. I like a cliffhanger, but you've got to wrap all this up. And then you can give me a cliffhanger that's going to take me onto the next narrative arc when we continue that story. And I think television shows and serialized fiction do a good job with this. Wrap it all up and then have a cliffhanger that makes me come back for season 2 and season 3 and season 4. But I get very frustrated, right, if something big happens in season 1 and they never wrap it up. Like, to me, that's kind of cheap storytelling. So this is something I really want you all thinking about for your, again, narrative essay, is how can I start where the action starts? And then I can go back and fill in those details. How can I bring conflict into my story? What is the most exciting part, and how can I bring that alive and add explosions and fireworks and car chases and things like that? And then how am I going to wrap everything up satisfactorily? This may seem a little bit kind of complicated and it may seem a little intimidating. So I will say that if we're just doing a basic Comp 1 narrative essay, simple, your inciting incident is your intro paragraph. Then you might add another paragraph on background, maybe not, maybe so. Second paragraph. Then maybe your rising action is the third. And then the climax, let's maybe make that the fourth and the fifth. Let's maybe make that a little bit bigger. And you do not have to follow this, folks. I'm just kind of trying to, for the math and science folks, give you a little bit of a formula for setting this up. Then your falling action, you could even do falling action and resolution. That could all be one paragraph. Again, this is not a one size fits all, but it is a good way that you might kind of organize your work. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about other types of narratives and plots and structures and things like that. But I will also note that not every story is going to follow this narrative arc in this way. So some are going to follow a different pattern. In the case of some, and I'm not usually too fond of it, sometimes it's more subtle. Sometimes it's kind of a gentle rolling hill, right? Sometimes it's kind of a flat line. I kind of felt this way about I Am Legend. Please don't kill me when I say this, but Will Smith and his dog walk around for like an hour and a half, and then the movie's about to get good, and then it ends. So somewhere like that. Now, some start way up here and just stay, like some of the good action movies, the big crazy ones, they'll come all the way up to the top and just be wild the whole way through. And then we have what I like to call the Tarantino model, which is where you start over here and then you kind of loop around to the back and then to the front, and then you go around and it kind of rambles on, and then it ends like that. The Tarantino model. So, not all narratives follow this specific kind of narrative arc, but it is a really good kind of pattern and way of thinking for how to tell a good story. So, we're going to start there with our basis. The next thing that I want to talk about is the different types of plot. Now, you may have heard that saying that every story has already been told. And I would tend to agree with that. Most stories are a variation on some other type of story. But there are 7 main plot archetypes. And you may be thinking in your narrative that maybe you're following one of these, possibly not, but they do tend to kind of fall into one, maybe two of these categories. So, rags to riches, right? We love a rags to riches. This is an underdog story, someone who, like a Cinderella, or to use Dickens and Oliver Twist, rises from absolutely nothing and becomes something. This has that character development that we really love, that conflict of character that we often look for. And I think that's because we often identify with an underdog story. And for those of us in rags, we sure would like some riches. And so we often find them inspirational. The next main archetype, and this is kind of like the oldest one in the book, is overcoming the monster. A character must overcome a fearsome beast or evil. And that might be the dragon, that might be the Goliath, that might be the Minotaur, it could be any kind of wild beast, which is often a metaphor for kind of mankind's darker impulses. But overcoming the monster is very, very common. Many of the stories that you loved as a kid maybe followed that overcoming the monster pattern. There's also the quest, and I want to put the quest next to Voyage and Return here and point these out together because they're very, very similar. In a quest, someone goes questing. Maybe they're trying to get the Holy Grail. Maybe it's that they are trying to find some kind of, I'm thinking they're about to make another, what's it called? Indiana Jones movie, a lot of questing in that, a lot of questing in video gaming. But we love a hero who's given a task. And I want to talk about the hero's journey in just a moment. But then Voyage and Return is also very, very similar to a quest. But in Voyage and Return, there's a core element where someone leaves home, one person, and then they leave, and then they return home transformed. So Quest and Voyage and Return are very, very similar. There's a lot of overlap, but a lot of times, like, the return home is not a key element of the quest. So I'm thinking especially about, say, your Lord of the Rings movies, right? The hobbits leave the Shire, they go on a quest, but it's a voyage, but then they return back to the Shire at the end, and that falls more into that voyage and return category. Then there's the 2 oldest in the book, comedy and tragedy. I say these are the oldest in the book. They're not, but these are, in terms of Western literary theater, these are kind of the most common. When we look at, say, a Shakespeare, again, not the oldest in the book, but in the Western world, some of the first written words, some of the first books. Now, a comedy, we know, is something that's funny, right? But a comedy in a traditional way is going to end in a wedding. And that's going to be a key feature of a good comedy, is it's going to end in a wedding. So some of you might actually want to write about your wedding day for your narrative and thinking about it as a comedy. And it doesn't have to be, could be an interesting kind of perspective or way of thinking about it. Then a tragedy is kind of the opposite of comedy. And that's really what this is. The laughing mask is comedy, and the sad mask is tragedy. And in a tragedy, Everybody dies at the end. So if we're thinking of Shakespeare, right, we're thinking of Hamlet, especially, or Othello, but he wrote plenty of comedies with weddings too. We're talking about Taming of the Shrew, or Much Ado About Nothing, or Midsummer Night's Dream, where there's just, there's conflict, but at the end, people get married and are married and happy. And then finally, there's rebirth. And this is a story in which a character is reborn into their essence. And this one is very common, I would say, in a lot of these, especially like a Rags to Riches, where what we are looking for is character growth, character development, someone who starts at the bottom and goes to the top, right? The Drake method. So these are your basic plot archetypes. And as you're thinking about telling your story, you might be thinking about which of these your story falls into. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, Kelly, I don't know, this is too much, don't worry about it. You can stop at narrative arc. Just tell me a story. That's all I'm really looking for here. But if you want to kind of bring in that extra literary layer, bringing in one of the core plot archetypes can be very helpful. Now, a different archetype that we often talk about with storytelling that's a little different from this is the hero's journey. And many of you are probably familiar with the hero's journey. It is especially prominent in most of the Disney and Pixar films that we grew up on and love. You have a hero who is called to some kind of adventure. They have a supernatural aid. Maybe that's a fairy, a monster, someone, it could be a spirit from the spirit world. And they are going to take that hero through a threshold into the unknown. And this is where their journey begins. They might need a helper. I'm thinking about like a Mr. Tumnus in the Chronicles of Narnia. They might need a mentor, like what's the Aslan, the lion in the Chronicles of Narnia. They're going to run into challenges. They're going to be tempted. Narnia, again, it fits this pretty well. In many of the stories that we love from our childhood fit this model here. Then they will find abyss, death, rebirth, revelation. They'll be transformed. They'll atone, which means that they'll regret their previous ways and be born again, and then they'll return back to the known. So this hero's journey cycle is a really helpful way of, if you're writing a hero, thinking about all of the things that they should go through. And it doesn't, of course, have to follow any of these models exactly. But what I'm hoping that this information does is give you a good kind of jumping off point to think, okay, I need to tell a story. I want it to be entertaining. I want it to kind of follow the narrative arc to kind of make sure that I'm taking my audience for a ride. I might be following one of those 7 common plot archetypes, whether I realize it or not. It may be there, especially if I'm really thinking about my characters and what they're going to go through. And it may also be a hero's journey as well. So I'm going to stop the video here, but I'm going to leave you with one of the best pieces of advice that I ever got. And I've been creative writing for as long as I can remember, and I love to be part of creative writing groups. And I've met some really amazing writers, much better than I, over the years, who have given me some great advice. But the best thing that I ever heard came from this brilliant playwright that I knew, that I don't think he ever became anything, but he once met Elmore Leonard. And Elmore Leonard is a Detroit author. He wrote some amazing novels that some got turned into movies many years ago. Get Shorty and Be Cool were some of the big ones. And my playwright friend said, "What's the secret?" And Elmore Leonard is an international bestseller. He said, "What's the secret? What do you do?" And this completely changed my thinking. Elmore Leonard said, "Write to entertain. Write to entertain. That completely changed my perspective around, because before I heard that, I was writing to be like one of the greats. I wanted to write like Dickens. I wanted to write like Hemingway. I wanted to write like my idols, but I don't, and I'm not, and I have a completely different life experience. So when I heard that piece of feedback, it just like washed all of this junk out of my mind. And I said, yeah, if I'm gonna write, it should be because I want to entertain people. Like I want them to feel something, and it could be that I want them to feel sad or angry or happy. Usually happy. I write pretty goofy stuff, but I think that if we think about just finding a way to entertain our audiences, we will often find some really, really great stories to tell along the way. I really hope that helps, and happy writing.